Well, hey, Heartland, welcome to my home. Thank you for inviting me into yours. I'm really looking forward to the day when we no longer need the space between us, when COVID and physical distancing is a thing of the past. I don't know about you, but every time I go into the grocery store, I kind of feel like this. If you're a Star Wars fan, you get this. Even if you're not, I'm sure you still understand. We've been in a study in the book of Ephesians since the beginning of September. And if you don't know anything about it, it's a book of the Bible, which is in the New Testament. It's a letter written by a guy named Paul to a church in Ephesus. Now, before I get to our text, do you ever stop and wonder where even is Ephesus? And why did Paul write this? Well, wonder no more, because I have a map. This is a map of Paul's second missionary journey. This was the second time he went around the Roman Empire telling people about Jesus. Now you can see Ephesus right there in the center of the map. And you see that whole region called Asia. You would know it as modern day Turkey. And these are the stops that Paul made on his journey, making his way back to the original church in Jerusalem, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner. And Paul ended up spending the majority of this trip in Ephesus, about 3.5 years. I hope he packed extra underwear. That's a long, long time. And you think, why would anyone go to Ephesus and why would anyone spend that much time there? Well, have you seen Ephesus? This is what Ephesus looks like today. Wouldn't you want to go to Ephesus? Aruba, Jamaica? Ooh, I want to take you. Come on. Lord, send me right about now. Have you looked outside? Now, this Ephesus was the fourth largest city in the Roman Empire, home to about 500,000 people at the time Paul wrote this letter. It was enormous in that day. It has a 24,000-seat amphitheater carved into the hillside, simply known as the theater. This theater was actually the gathering place of a riot because Paul's preaching was causing such a disturbance throughout the whole city of Ephesus. And you can read about that whole thing in Acts chapter 19. It's a very, very cool story. I want to read a snippet to you as a backdrop for this week's message. From Acts chapter 19, starting at verse 29. It says, "Soon the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and rushed as one man into the theater. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. The assembly was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing, some another. And this is great. I like this. It says, most of the people did not even know why they were there. Isn't that just like a mob that forms? Most of the people don't even know why they're there or what they're doing. They just see it as an opportunity to start smashing something. Well, this was 2,000 years ago. But it kind of sounds like today, doesn't it? We live in a very divided culture. We've got different groups saying different things. There's rioting, there's political and racial tension. And maybe some of us are just confused by it all and we don't even know what to think. And unfortunately, the church is not immune to disunity. There are many differing opinions on what's going on in our world and how the church should be responding to it. And as a result, it's causing division, anger, and confusion. But God's heart is that his church would maintain unity. Jesus prayed that the church would be one. In Paul's letter to the Ephesians, one of the main themes running through the whole thing is unity. As it's been talked about over the last number of weeks, one of the issues in this Ephesian church was the animosity between Jewish believers and Gentile believers. Now, you could say there was a lot of space between them. You see, a Gentile was anyone of any race or distinction other than Jewish. Because they were not God's chosen people, they were treated as outcasts, less than, second class, and alienated. But not just ignored, not just let's keep a distance from them. The hostility and hatred went really deep. For example, if a young Jewish man or woman married a Gentile, their families would hold a funeral service for them, symbolizing the death of their child as far as religion, race, and family were concerned. They're basically saying, you are dead to us. And then also, out of fear of contamination, many Jews wouldn't even enter the home of a Gentile or allow a Gentile to enter theirs. For hundreds of years, the animosity, the space between Jew and Gentile had festered and grown, and there were still traces of it in the church. The Gentiles were outsiders, considered less than, but now, because of what Christ has done, Paul says, he's telling us two things. He says, you're no longer excluded, and now you belong. You're no longer excluded, and now you belong. Let's take a look at our text in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 19 to 22. He says, so then you are no longer foreigners and aliens, but fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him you two are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. So first he says, you are no longer excluded. You are no longer foreigners and aliens. So what is a foreigner? Well, basically it's a cultural outsider. If you find yourself in a land where you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, when you don't know anyone, you can't communicate with anybody, maybe the food tastes a little weird, you feel uncomfortable and lonely, you might be a foreigner. And Paul says to his readers, you are no longer foreigners and aliens. Now he used this same term earlier in this chapter in verse 12, where he says you are separated from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise without hope and without God in the world. Now, who's he writing to? See, they weren't literally foreigners. The people he's writing to were living in their native land. They knew their own language. They knew the culture. And what does he mean? In what way are they foreigners? He means spiritually. What Paul is saying here, which is one of the main themes of the Bible, is that in our natural state, spiritually speaking, we're not at home. We're homeless. Because the Bible would say that the human heart and the human soul is only at home in God. Psalm 90, it says he is our eternal home. We are exiles living in a world that does not fit our deepest desires at all. C.S. Lewis, he says, if I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world. We're foreigners and aliens. And Paul says we were all that way until we found our way back to Jesus. And Paul moves on to say, not only are you no longer foreigners and aliens, but now you belong. And this reality of belonging is significant. It's not just, well, you can come in, but sit in the corner, but don't make any noise. It's like, no. There's a seat at the table for you. You have equal share. And Paul gives us three images of belonging. The images are first that we are fellow citizens. Then secondly, we are members of God's household. And thirdly, that we are stones in a temple being built for God's Spirit to dwell. And what you're going to notice is that each of these images is deliberately important. And each of them are deliberately more intense than the one before in our relationship to God and one another. So first he says we are fellow citizens with God's people. Now this is the image of a nation. But I think the word citizen might get lost on us Canadians a little bit. Because when it comes to being Canadians, I think it'd be fair to say that we're patriotic, but we're not fanatic. We love our country, but we're not crazy about it. And for most, our identity really isn't wrapped up in our Canadian citizenship. But for Paul writing this in the first century, he knows what citizenship means to them. What it meant to be a Roman citizen was everything to them. What it meant to be Jewish was everything to them. It's something that can't be bought. It's a birthright. It was the source of their pride and identity. And Paul takes that identity of citizenship and he elevates it to say you are a citizen of God's kingdom. Paul is saying here that we've come to possess a citizenship far superior to any local citizenship or even the coveted Roman citizenship. Paul is saying, now you belong in a way that you never did before, in a way that you never could have dreamed of belonging. See, the Gentiles, they used to be stateless and disenfranchised outsiders, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel. But now he says to them, you have a new citizenship. You are fellow citizens with the saints, the Jewish people. Citizens of God's kingdom, a kingdom without borderlines, dividing walls, or territorial jurisdiction. And God's kingdom is God himself ruling his people. And like any citizen in any country, it bestowed upon them all the privileges and responsibilities that come with it. They're no longer foreigners and aliens, but belonging to a new society with a new identity. And then he says, not only are you citizens, but you are members of God's household. Now, this is the image of a family. As satisfying as it is to be a fellow citizen, being family is a far deeper intimacy. Because you see, a king lives in a country with his people, but with family, it's the image of a father living under the same roof with his children. And think about what that means in terms of our access to God. See, not all citizens have access to the king. In fact, probably very few. But children have equal access to their father. See, if I were to phone Ottawa and ask to speak to the Prime Minister, even if I played the citizen card and I said, listen, I'm a citizen and I need to speak to the Prime Minister, do you think they'll put me through? Probably not. But if I called my dad and I were to say, Dad, I really need to talk to you, don't you think my dad would drop everything that he's doing to listen to me? Of course he would, because I'm his favorite. No, well, I mean, that might be true, but he would because I'm his child. And he's a good father. It's who he is. It's who he is. This image of family gets even more intense in regard with our relationship to one another. Because if you're citizens, you may live miles away from each other, but siblings growing up in the same home, you don't just live miles apart, you live feet apart. I grew up sharing a room with my brother. Some of you shared a bed with your sibling. And then the metaphor gets even more relationally intense as he says that we are a temple. Now that's the image of a building. We are stones in a building, not citizens that live miles apart, not family that live just feet apart. But when you're stones in a building, there's no space between you at all. You're cemented together. And God isn't just a king ruling over subjects or even a father under the same roof, but God lives within the building. We are joined together to become a dwelling place in which God lives by his Spirit. He's in every stone. And here's where these images cause me, at least, I hope they cause us to stop and think. Tim Keller, he says this, that the more powerful a force that shapes you, the more fitted you are to everyone else who is shaped by that same force. The more powerful a force that shapes you, the more fitted you are to everyone else who is shaped by that same force. For example, culture is powerful. You know, if you're traveling outside of the country and you run into a fellow countryman, you feel a certain affinity toward them, right? There's a bond, there's a kinship there. There's that moment where it's, oh, you're Canadian too. Yeah, oh, great. High fives. But we all know that family is more powerful than that. Those you call mom and dad or brother and sister, those from the same home, that's a much more powerful force than and you're even more bonded and fitted to them. But then when you're a brick, being shaped in the oven, say, you fit perfectly with the brick next to you. So there's no space between you at all. You are one. So the more powerful a force that shapes you, the more fitted you are to everyone else who is shaped by that same force. The most powerful force of all, then, for those who are in Christ, would be the gospel, the good news of Jesus. And if the gospel has touched you, it's more powerful than how your country has shaped you. It's more powerful than how your family has shaped you. And Paul is saying there is no more profound shaping force than that. other than the gospel. It shapes your identity, your understanding of yourself, your worldview, and as a result, all human beings that have been shaped by the gospel are now bonded more tightly to one another than by any other force in their life. If you call yourself a Christian, there is nothing else in this life that should be more powerful than your unity and oneness with other Christ followers. But it begs the question, how do we live it? Because the key word in that last sentence was should. Our bond with other believers should be the most powerful force in our life. If we are citizens, we need to live like citizens. If we're family, it means we need to live like part of the family. But let's be realistic. I know what some of you must be thinking because I think it too. You're saying, I don't feel that tied to other Christians. Some of them are very different from me, and some of them I don't even like. I don't feel these incredible ties like every other Christian I meet is my brother or my sister. And I think some of them are just out to lunch on their viewpoint or what they believe about our world today and how they're responding to it. I really don't want anything to do with them. You say, what do I do about that? Oh, I don't know. Good luck. I don't know that I can wrap it up in a pretty bow. We're human. It's part of our sinful nature. It's not God's heart for his church. It's not what should be, but it's a reality sometimes. That there are all kinds of things that can cause space between us, but I think one thing that will always help bring us back to unity, can I suggest, is submission to the lordship of Jesus. The lordship of Jesus simply means submission to his authority, to his rule and reign in your life. And now listen, Paul says that Jesus is the cornerstone in this building metaphor. Every ancient Hebrew understood the importance of the cornerstone. It determines the stability of the foundation and the character of the entire building. The Jerusalem temple itself had huge foundation stones, one measuring 29 feet in length. The cornerstone decided the architectural unity and symmetry, the lay of the walls, the dimensions of the structure. They were a result of the cornerstone itself. And here's what I found really interesting about it, is that all other stones had to be adjusted to it. All other stones in the building had to be adjusted to the cornerstone. And remember what Keller says, that the more powerful a force that shapes you, the more fitted you are to everyone else who is shaped by that same force. But maybe one of the reasons some of us who genuinely call ourselves Christ followers don't feel all that tied to other Christians is because we aren't all that shaped by Christ in our day-to-day lives. See, Jesus can be in the suburbs of your life, or he can be downtown. You can exclude him in your day-to-day thoughts, patterns, behaviors, or he can be at the very core. And Jesus becomes the most crucial part of your foundation, not just when he's Savior, but when he's Lord. When you bring him into your everyday, when we readjust our thoughts, our behaviors, our patterns under his lordship. It's when you can't think without him, you can't feel without him, you can't solve any problem without him. He informs your decisions and he impacts your relationships. Now imagine if every Christ follower, if every stone were operating and were adjusted to the lordship of Jesus, our cornerstone. You've got a unified structure. And there's really nothing that could tear it down. David Guzik, he writes this. He says that the wall of separation is gone because the common lordship is greater than any previous division. If the lordship of Christ is not greater than any difference that you or I have with other believers, whether political, racial, economic, language, geography, whatever, then you have not fully understood what it means to be under the lordship of Jesus. We are one body, the church, where our unity in Jesus is far greater than any of our previous differences. Now, please hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that we strive for unity at all costs, because we should not compromise truth for the sake of unity. But if Jesus is the cornerstone of your life, then our unity and oneness in him is far greater than anything that might come between us. Jesus is the one that holds all us together. It's unity under his lordship. And unity does not mean everyone has to agree with your viewpoint. I mean, some of you take unity to mean that everyone has to see things your way, and if not, they're the ones that need to be readjusted. Submission to one another doesn't mean or imply uniformity. We aren't going to see eye to eye with everyone. I mean, we're human, we're flawed. But when we are part of the same nation, the same family, glued together as a building, our unity in Jesus is far greater than any difference we might have. You know, all of Ephesians chapter 2 points toward radical hospitality toward one another. Think about it. You were foreigners and aliens, and now you're in God's household. Did you know that the Greek word for foreigner is xenes? It's where we get the word xenophobia, which means the dislike of or prejudice against people from other countries. But the Greek word for hospitality is philoxenia, and that means the love of the weird person, the love of the strange person, the person where we'd say, ew, let's just stay away. Hospitality is loving the strange person. It's the person that's different from you, that thinks differently or acts differently. And if you think about it, that's all of us. I mean, I'm weird. I know a lot of you personally are weird. But that's okay. I mean, we still love you. But that's radical hospitality. It's loving the weird person. Philoxenia. Loving and accepting people where they're at. But what's amazing is that Ephesians says that you and I are the objects of the greatest act of hospitality in history. That we were all foreigners and we were brought into God's household. How? Well, hospitality is always expensive, but nothing like God's act of hospitality toward us. Did you notice when Jesus Christ came to earth that he was homeless? It says foxes have holes, birds have nests, but Jesus had no place to lay his head. He made himself nothing. In his death, he was homeless. He was forsaken by everyone, even his own father. And I mean, he was a son. He was the son, and he was cast out. He became a foreigner, an alien, so that we could be brought in. And that eternal space between us and God that could not be bridged is now bridged because of what Christ has done. And if you believe that, that should be the most powerful force in your life, shaping you. And that will fit you more for other people who are shaped by it too. And for those of you who aren't Christ followers, I realize the idea that within the church you can be so deeply tied and connected with others probably feels a little weird. I know that just might feel weird to you. But isn't that what you want? No one on their deathbed says, I wish I would have spent more time at the office. They say, I wish I would have spent more time with my family or my friends, or had deeper relationships, that I had been more forgiving or more loving toward others. Love and community is what life is all about. And this is a love in God and a community in God that's going to last forever. Isn't that what you're looking for? Well, one of the things we do around here every week is give a blessing at the end of our service. So if you'd like to receive that, I'd invite you can open up your hands for that. This is from 2 Thessalonians. It says, now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times and in every way. The Lord be with you all. Amen. God bless you. Have a great week. That's where we want to go. We're going to go to Jamaica. Ooh, the hostility and hatred went really deep. Dog.
Is that to go outside?
Yeah.
No way.
Lucy! Sit. Lucy. Okay, Lucy. Can you sit pretty? Sit pretty. Good puppy.